All right, well, another good article we ran this week starts with this idea. You know, it's an old truism that if you want to improve something, you first need to properly measure it, right? And quite naturally, for those of us in the quality and or continuous improvement space, that truth is, to paraphrase Stephen Colbert, even truthier. Isn't it truthier? Truthiness, I think, was his actual his new word, but truthier is my new word for the year 2018.
Maybe we can get him on the show.
Maybe it's there we go. Stephen Colbert, Dr. Stephen T. Colbert. Well, 5 questions you must answer to measure your business well appeared in Monday's issue of the Quality Digest newsletter. It was written by the always entertaining and always informative Mike Figliolo of thoughtleaders.com. And you can see it right there. Figliolo's point here is that you need a laser-like focus, not just on data, which of course is important, we just talked about this, but on information, which is critical. So data is important, information is critical, and those things are used interchangeably. We've said this many times. They're really not. Data is one thing, information is another, so don't confuse them. To turn mounds of data into discrete pieces of actionable information that can really fine-tune your business, you should strive to understand these 5 questions that Figliolo alludes to in the title of his article. And I want to run through them with you. We have a slide that'll just kind of lay them out for you, and I'll run through them with you, and I'll give you a little bit of background about what these mean. The first one is, what's the measurement's purpose? Okay, again, these are the 5 questions you must answer to measure your business well. So, what's the measurement's purpose? Well, you know, you got to know this going in so you don't measure the wrong thing for what might appear to be the right reason. You need to understand the significance of the metric and how the business is going to improve based on what you discover. I mean, you don't just gather information just to gather information without having any idea of what it maybe will mean. You need a kind of a starting point. And by the way, later in this piece, I'm going to give an example that Figliolo offered from his career about how these things are actually made actionable in a company he worked for. So we'll get to that, and I'll bring back these 5 points in a moment. But let's look, for the time being, at point number 2. What data source will you use? And this one is really important because your results, and more importantly, the context of those results, are really greatly affected by your choice or the choices you make in answering that particular question. Number 3 is, how are you going to calculate the metric? You know, you want to properly define your formula, especially for really complex measures. You want to understand what the formula is and what that formula means. It's not just a series of numbers. It's measuring things that are actually happening in the real world, boiling that down to a metric that makes some sense that you can point to and say, okay, this is what that metric means in the real world. Point 4 is, how frequently will you measure? This is a really important one for me because you don't want to ever forget that everything you do represents a choice in terms of the allocation of resources. So be efficient and measure only as often as necessary. On the other hand, don't measure so infrequently that you lose sight of what's going on. You don't want to measure all the time. You don't want to measure something every hour just because you can. I mean, it's going to be kind of a waste. But on the other hand, don't measure it every year if you need to know it more frequently because you're not going to be able to track it. The 5th one is, who will review the measure? Again, you know, you want to be efficient, but not so efficient that you lose sight and lose insight. I mean, define the stakeholders who are going to receive the information, and be careful not to include extraneous folks who don't add value, but don't leave anybody out either. It's kind of like point 4. It's kind of a balance there. You know, the phrase I use, you don't want to burn anybody's clock. You don't want to kind of say to everybody, hey, take a look at this and give me your opinion on it while they're doing other things. And it's like, well, what they're adding is so minuscule. I mean, maybe there's some value, but you know, don't even worry about it. Really try to laser-like focus on those people that really can add value to the interpretation of that. So, as I promised, for a sense of how these questions were actually worked in a real-world environment, Figliolo talks about an organization he once worked for that delivered in-home services to their customers. And this organization wanted to measure the performance of their technicians in some specific way. So what they wanted to do is they wanted to measure the technicians as a group and individually as well, and how they were performing when they were in people's homes and what they were doing. So that's a really good measure. So again, they understood going in, point 1, what is the measurement's purpose? They understood going in that, you know, to measure the amount of work performed by their technicians They also wanted to understand their customer retention rate. So there were really kind of two axes for the data they were trying to gather here. It was how much work was performed, how well it was performed, and how many customers they retained. That was the second part of this that was really important. So what data sources are they going to use? Well, I mean, the two clear and consistent ones were, first were the production numbers, the amount of work that actually was done, and the second one was the customer retention rate numbers. So very easy to have those two numbers. We're all pretty much right there. How are you going to calculate the metric? Well, they decided simply to multiply the production numbers by the percentage of retained customers. And they did this again by technician, which is very important because they were able to determine which technicians were doing a really good job of both providing good service, doing the work that needed to be done, and retaining the amount of customers that were there. The frequency was weekly. They just decided as they were looking at this that they needed to know this stuff on a weekly basis. Weekly was just the one that happened to work for them. They could have done it more frequently, daily, but that wouldn't have been as efficient. Sure. If they did it monthly, it wouldn't have been as efficient either. And then who reviewed the measure? And the entire leadership team really did. But specifically, the head of customer service and the branch managers were really the most important. They decided that those people, the service manager and the branch managers, needed to know because they needed to know what their technicians were doing and which technicians were good. The metric that was ultimately produced here, which they called the retention adjusted production number, allowed the managers to see how their technicians were functioning, both again as a group and individually, and being able to intelligently and intentionally craft this metric allowed them to not only gain insight into business critical performance, but also to identify poor performers and modify behaviors for improved results. That's really a critical thing here. If technicians going in and you see the numbers aren't really doing very well, you can jump on that pretty quickly. Again, they were measuring it weekly, so that worked for them really, really well. And the great thing about this technique is that it works for pretty much any kind of metric. It works for quantitative metrics, qualitative metrics, or custom metrics like the one that Figliolo talked about. It's basically looking at your overall business and considering it like you would any individual process you might want to measure. Figliolo doesn't say this. I always say that. It's like the author doesn't. I want to make a point. It wasn't. This was my idea. This is my thought on this as I read this. He doesn't say it, but I thought about this as kind of somewhat akin to SBC that you run on the entire enterprise. In other words, this exercise helps you ensure that your organization remains in control. I mean, as an organization, many people think about SPC and say, okay, well, I want to know if that machine's in control, if that process is in control, statistical process control, of course, but you think about an entire organization, and if you can build the right metrics, you really have SPC on the entire enterprise. Right. That's a really valuable, powerful thing to be able to do. So consider that when you're looking at metrics and how you want to measure your overall business. And think about the 5 questions that Mike asked in that question.
What strikes me out with this is this actually, in a sense, kind of averts the problem in the previous story.
You're right.
Because I mean, if you're constantly, as your boss, if the boss is constantly being presented with facts on a weekly basis or daily basis, whatever it is, it's going to be harder for them to develop this mindset that everything's okay.
Right.
Because those kind of things are usually built up over time. You're not getting feedback on the product. You think the product is great. 6 months are going by and you think everything's fine. Meanwhile, it's all falling apart, but you aren't getting daily information. Yeah. If you're getting it on a daily basis, it's going to be hard for you to fall into this position where you think everything's good, because it takes time to build up that belief, right?
The great quote that I always love, "In God we trust, all others bring data."
Bring data, that's right.
That's exactly what this means, both those stories.